Well, welcome everyone back to another exciting episode of Ask Evoke with me, Scott Johnston, and Kylee Toth. Uh, it's always fun to get these questions from folks. Some of them are getting incredibly detailed and very difficult to answer because it's hard to know, what specifically pertains to a person, an individual, and we don't know that much about their training. So I would say, if you can keep your questions more in the general area, that really, I think it'll be more helpful for you, and because we're going to be guessing wildly otherwise, and it'll also be more helpful to the rest of the audience who can take away something from it. So we're really kind of only prepared to talk big picture concepts here, not how to program your year, without, again, not knowing you. So keep that in mind. But again, we love having these questions come in, and we've been getting flooded with them. So without further ado, let's dive in, Kylee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Scott, I just mentioned if you do have a question like that, we have reasonably priced phone consultations, and a coach would be happy to go into very detailed with you personally. So that's an option for people too. But
Yeah.
yeah, here we go with our first question. It's from Josh, and he says, based on what I've learned from training for the uphill athlete, the goal for muscular endurance work is to have the limiter be the legs rather than the heart rate, usually with the quads getting a particular shout out. When I do uphill weighted carries, I'd say my legs are the limiting factor more so than my breathing, but I feel it predominantly in my calves rather than my quads, as in the calf pump feels like they're going to pop. I can think of two ways to interpret that. Either my calves are weak or I need to tweak my training setup to get the emphasis on the quads, maybe more weight, less incline. And so I think that this is Josh's question.
Yeah.
Something to.
Well, it's a really good question, Josh, and I happen to have some personal experience in this area. So there is a third possibility here, and you're not going to like it, but I think I need to tell you anyway, just out of transparency. That feeling that your calves feel like they're going to explode, like they're literally a balloon that's about to pop, that is a symptom. It can be, I should say. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physical therapist, but I once had this problem. It can be a symptom of compartment syndrome. And
Mm.
I'll give a non-medical description of compartment syndrome and then how it works and why it feels this way. So, as you probably are aware, each skeletal muscle in our body is contained in a piece of fascia. And the fascia is actually what contains the muscle, connects it to the tendons so that the muscle can do its work. Well, that fascia isn't very elastic. So when a muscle begins to fill up with blood, of course, it's going to expand. As it's doing more work, it tends to fill up with more blood, and gets a little bigger. And if the fascia can't um, stretch enough, then the pressure inside that muscle compartment just goes through the roof, and it will feel like your calves are going to pop. And I've known a number of people with this. And the ultimate solution is surgery, which I had surgery myself to alleviate this problem, but it's a surgery with some significant downfalls. You can get this diagnosed. They basically, what they do is they have you do things like what you're talking about here, walking uphill, or maybe you do a whole bunch of like heel lifts, up onto your toes until you start to feel this pump. And then they actually stick a pressure gauge into your calf and see what the pressure is inside the compartments. And they know what normal pressure should feel like. But what happens when this takes place is, yeah, if your lower legs are kind of going numb and you lose a little bit of motor control in your foot, that's because the motor nerves that go into your lower legs get compressed by all this pressure in the compartments. And so that, I don't know what other treatments available. I've talked to physical therapists about this. Maybe it's fascial release type work, deep tissue that can be done. But don't rule that out as a possibility for what's going on with you. But because when I read that sentence, it said my calves feel like they're going to pop. That's
Mm.
exactly what compartment syndrome feels like. And they're hard, like you reach down and touch them, they're hard as a rock. And so that's a possibility. But what I would do to alleviate that is I would start doing these weighted climbs on a stair machine, so that you're walking up a set of stairs rather than an inclined hill where your calves, whether it's on a steep treadmill or outside, when you're walking up an incline, your calves do more work than when you're walking up a set of stairs. So that would be something that could, I think, allow you to focus more on your quads and not have your calves be a limiter in the meantime. It's basically, we're dealing with a symptom here. We're not necessarily curing the calf problem. I don't think it's because your calves are weak, again, because of that sensation that they feel like they're going to pop.
Mm-hmm.
So I would give it a try. Can you do a pretty good muscular endurance weighted hike with, you said you're using about 50 or 60 pounds. Can you do that on a stair machine and have it feel like, your calves or excuse me, your quads are the limiter? Then I would shift to that for my near-term goal, and then try to get this other problem diagnosed. I don't think they're related.
Scott, do you see compartment syndrome in more commonly in certain training histories? Like you were a Nordic skier and swimmer. Is there any kind of, or is it just, you know, not
Where
luck
it's
of the draw, I
where
guess?
No, you see it sometimes with runners. It's not uncommon at all with runners, but where I experienced it was in the early 80s when the sport of cross country skiing was changing and introduced skating on our skis. That was a completely new type of activity, and lots of skiers ended up with compartment syndrome around that time. And I've known others, skiers, who subsequently have had it. Mostly it's been biathletes, because biathletes, their races are only skating, whereas in cross country, you do the diagonal stride or classic technique and skating. So you train both, and it doesn't put quite as much stress on just the calves. But I've known a number of biathletes who, because they train all exclusively with skating, we're having problems with that. But I've also known a number of runners that have gotten this. I don't think I've heard of any other. I've never heard of someone else getting it besides runners
Yeah.
and skiers.
No, that's interesting. Josh had a little secondary part to his question, so I'll add it in because I think other people might be interested as well. He said, even though the limiter in muscular endurance is my legs, my heart rate is usually jacked up too. He said, over 170. I tend to ignore it and proceed, but curious if I should be keeping my heart rate lower during those sessions, even if it means stopping and going a bit more.
No, don't pay attention to your heart rate during these muscular endurance things. That's not what we're trying to target. I mean, yeah, your heart rate often will go up. But if the weight is heavy enough, and it might be that, Josh, you're pretty darn strong, and because it says you're using 60 pounds, I think. But my guess is that if you were to use 70 or 75 pounds, you wouldn't see that 170 heart rate anymore, because you'd be moving quite a bit slower. And yeah, so that's what I would say, that if you want to mess around with this, just add some more weight and see if your heart rate goes down. But that's really not that important. You're only spending an hour or so per week doing this type of training. It's not going to really mess up your base training at all. So I wouldn't worry that your heart rate is getting way up into, zone 3 or so. I don't think that's important.
Yeah, I think you hit something on the head there when you said that you should probably only be doing it once a week, is for people to remember that muscular endurance has a high training stress, right? Score. So if your heart rate is up, that is congruent sometimes with a stress on your legs, but you need to account for that being a really hard workout in your week.
Even some of the best professional alpinists I've worked with, they only do one of these kind of weighted uphill hikes in a week. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
plenty to see. And we can see really good gains. I mean, I'm talking Uli Steck and David Gotler, climbing the south face of Shishapangma, up and down in a day. So, I mean, these are people who can move really fast in the mountains and have a very high work capacity, but yet one of these sessions a week seems to be enough stimulus to get the job done. And I don't think piling more stress on top would necessarily get the benefits we'd be looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like quality over quantity. Because I actually had a client who, when they first came to me, they did 3 of these kind of workouts a week, but I realized that it was fairly low weight. And essentially, I feel like it just maybe it trained a bit of durability, but it was just wearing them down at the end of the day.
Yes. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
not able to recover. I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
and there is a time and a place for just training to suffer a little bit, but it shouldn't be a regular part of your routine. Every now
Mm-hmm.
and then, whether it's in a race or on a climb, or maybe a special workout that you're doing that pushes you into that near exhaustion stage or state, it can be beneficial. But doing that on a frequent basis is the fastest track to overtraining or injury. So I almost never, even with some of the strongest athletes I work with, we never push to exhaustion.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. All right. The next question we have here is from Shanta. And Shanta says that I'm a listener of the podcast and they enjoy listening. So that's awesome. Thanks for being here. And they've worked with Evoke in the past and done a 24-week training program for mountaineering. But her question, or his in particular, is he says, a friend of mine who is an amateur endurance athlete told me that if you during a base aerobic workout enter into anaerobic territory, then any base aerobic work you do immediately thereafter is compromised, meaning that it is unlikely to do much good from a base building perspective. He explained this as something about your anaerobic system being triggered, consuming glycol, and that your body cannot easily immediately switch back to aerobic mode even if you lower your heart rate back down into your aerobic zone. Do I need to tell my friend to check what he is rolling in his cigarette paper on the one hand, or do I need to approach my workouts differently on the other hand? If my friend is right, then any time I purposely or accidentally jump into the anaerobic zone during a base building workout, then my subsequent work is mostly a waste of time. Given this happens either on purpose or accidentally about half the time in my base workouts, at roughly the halfway mark, that suggests that 25% of my base building is lost. And that's bad news for me. I'm curious to know the answer here, and I'm sure other listeners could benefit from clearing up this matter as well. So, an interesting question.
It
Yeah.
is, and we get this from time to time. And I'll say a few things about this, that the transition from being, let's say, predominantly aerobic to predominantly anaerobic isn't a distinct line in the sand that you cross over. It's a gray area. It's a transition, a gradual transition metabolically as you begin to use more and more. Well, this person said glycol, but it's actually glycogen, the energy for anaerobic metabolism. But as the intensity goes up, there will be a point where that begins to dominate. The glycogen metabolism begins to dominate, but it doesn't just happen like the snap of fingers. So, and then the other thing is it is reversible. Yes, you go over that border. It would depend on how far you moved into that more anaerobic type metabolism, how much you fired it up, and how long it would then take to kind of calm the anaerobic system back down and get back more aerobically. But if that were true, then it would mean that in a race, let's say a short race where people are often operating right at or just above and below this, what we would call the anaerobic threshold, that would mean that when they went above the anaerobic threshold, they'd be they wouldn't be able to recover. Their aerobic system wouldn't be able to recover, but we know that's not the case. If they slow down, I mean, you can test this on yourself, doing, our anaerobic threshold test, which is essentially a time trial, and go for 30 minutes as hard as you can. And during that time, you'll notice that your heart rate will stabilize around a certain number. And let's say it's 165. And you'll notice that if you speed up and it goes up to 167, your body will very quickly tell you, hey, you need to slow down if you want to keep going, or I'm going to have to stop. Or if you slowed, let's say you did slow down, it drops down to 163, that's going to feel a little easy to you. And you've identified then this transition zone at around 165 for you. But just by virtue of your playing with this, going above the anaerobic threshold, maybe you go for a couple of minutes at 170, and by necessity, you're probably going to want to slow down, and you drop down to 160 for a few minutes, you'll be back into that aerobic metabolism again. So I don't think that your friend is right about, like, once you pass through this over this point, that the workout is toast. No. But one thing I would comment on here is, if you're spending 50% of your training time in an aerobic base workout above your aerobic zone, then you're not really in an aerobic base building workout, because it's not that it's not a wasteful workout. It's not ruined. But if your goal, let's say, is to improve aerobic deficiency, then training above your aerobic threshold isn't going to improve that. And so to make best use of those aerobic base training workouts, you should try to remain below the aerobic threshold. Now, if it bumps up, you start running up a hill for a minute or so, and it goes a few beats above aerobic threshold, that's not a big deal. But spending 50% of the workout above the aerobic threshold, I think will have, maybe not a negative effect, but it's not going to have the positive effect you'd like to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. I think what you said near the start about how far you're going into your anaerobic system too, like a real world example of this for a lot of people they could relate to is when they run a race, and most of us start or way too hard, right? You're out there, and depending on how too hard you start, you could actually just blow up. Like if you and have to walk or something, if you full sprinted for 1 minute on a time trial, a VK or something, because you're like way above you're fully anaerobic. And then takes a while to recover and come back down. But if you're just in your zone 3, it's a little bit different. So I think what you were saying about the level of depth you go into that is a bit applicable too. Maybe you've explained this to me before, but I think the listeners would be interested in what happens in your body when you hammer off the start and try to play catch up a bit too.
Yeah,
For racing.
that's a good point. And I will address that, because it's kind of it's a slightly different subject on
Mm-hmm.
pacing. But I just realized something as I was rereading this question. I think there might be some confusion here. We're talking about, the anaerobic versus aerobic. Well, for a very simplistic view, let's say you have a 4-zone system where, below aerobic threshold we have zones 1 and 2, and in those all the energy is predominantly coming from the aerobic system. And above the anaerobic threshold, which is what we would call zone 4, and sometimes people add a zone 5 in there for very hard work, then as you just said, you're pretty much fully anaerobic when you get into that zone. There is a little contribution from the aerobic system still, but the anaerobic system is dominating, which is why lactate builds up so quickly, and why you need to, stay. You can't stay in zone 4 indefinitely. You're only going to be able to stay in zone 4 for a few minutes before having to, especially if you're very far into zone 4. But what I think these two fellows or people might be missing here is there's this middle zone, zone 3. Mm-hmm. And that's that transition zone I was talking about. The bottom of zone 3, which is very close to the aerobic threshold, then, yeah, you're probably 60% of the energy, or excuse me, 40% of the energy is probably coming from the aerobic metabolism, and 60 might be coming from the anaerobic. But by the time you get up to the top end of zone 3, that ratio will have, completely change and be more like, you're getting 10% of your energy from the aerobic system and 90 from the anaerobic system. So you have this, that's what zone 3 is. It's kind of transitioning you from a very aerobic work capacity, work state to quite an anaerobic one. And it would depend not only, like Kylee was just saying, how far into that zone 3 or even up into zone 4 you went, and how long you stay there. So, but again, I'll go back and just say, don't spend, half your time. If the purpose of that workout is to build aerobic base, don't spend half your time above your aerobic threshold, because you won't be doing what you think you're doing. Now your question about like what happens when you start off really hard like that is that, anybody who's ever raced has probably felt this. We've all made this pacing mistake of going out too hard and then being forced to slow down. And that's because we've exceeded the body's ability to take up the lactate, the muscles that are producing the work, to take up lactate and use it for energy. And also, the liver and the heart also use lactate for energy. And so lactate can accumulate, and it can accumulate very fast, like you said, within a minute or so. Anybody who wants to test this on themselves just needs to go out and sprint up a hill as hard as they can for a minute, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about here. I don't care how mentally strong you are, some point during that minute, probably after 30 seconds, somewhere along in there, you will have to slow down. And it doesn't matter how tough you are. There's just the physiological reality is that the muscles stop working, or they begin to slow down their ability to contract. So two things I think are very important. If you're engaging in a high intensity event, like a short race, let's say a local 5-kilometer or even a 10K race, is you need to have a very good warm up, because you want the aerobic system really fired up and working fully, so that when the gun goes off and you start hard, the aerobic system is already up and running and metabolizing well, and it can then take up this lactate and do something with it to get it out of the system so it doesn't bog you down. Whereas if you were to go to the line cold, without a warm up, then there's a very good chance that the aerobic system won't, because remember, the aerobic system is rather slow to respond to changes in intensity. And that's why, we would normally in skiing, we'd finish our warm-ups with at least 2 or 3 1 or 2 minute, like, call them intervals, just pickups and up to speed, that get your heart rate really cranked up. And then when you start the race, again, you've got the aerobic system online, because the anaerobic system will come online as soon as the gun goes off. It doesn't really need a warm up. That's kind of its purpose, is to make up for the fact that the aerobic system is slow to respond. So good warm up is one way to prevent this. And then the other thing is to start out perhaps more conservatively than you think you should. And this is especially true in long races. And maybe we should, not today, but at some point, Kylee, we should talk about like the difference between warming up for a 5K and warming up for a 50K. They're quite different. But do you think I covered that?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think that, that Shanta should review the difference between aerobic and anaerobic, because one thing, talking to you, like, truly anaerobic is not something you can sustain for, it's under 2 minutes, really, right? It's short. So we're talking about really maximal efforts. And so I think he or she was talking more about like a zone 3 jumping into. So
that's what I think I realized after rereading it. But so hopefully, Shanta, we covered that. But it's a good question. Like, where is that point? And how much time should I spend above and below it?
Totally. And the one thing I'll add, just because I've probably done every training mistake on myself here and there, is if you do bump up towards zone 3 or higher, even towards anaerobic, you throw them in a long run or something, and then you want to finish the mileage, you will need to eat something. That's the closest I've ever been to bonking. I did like 5 by 3 minutes near max or something once, and then tried to run for 2 hours without eating, because you've torched up so much glucose with that hard effort off the cuff, and you're so depleted.
Exactly.
So don't do that.
No, that's
Learn
a good
from
point.
me.
Yeah. Eat before high intensity and after high intensity.
Yeah.
And another thing to do too, another way is to separate those workouts.
Oh, yeah. Should be
do your high
separated.
intensity in one place. I mean, there's a time and a place to do what you did,
Yeah.
although it would have been better if you had some snacks with you.
Yeah.
But there's a time and a place to combine intensity and volume, but not very often. And normally
No.
we'd suggest training those in 2 different workouts.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It was a product of busy mom syndrome a while back when I was like, just get that in there. But training doesn't work that way. So, all right. Our next question is from Stefan, and he says, how do you know if the weekly volume/intensity is just right to progress without shifting into overtraining or injury risk? In the past years, I trained approximately 9 to 13 hours per week. This is also a really good question. Yeah.
It is, but it's also one of those questions that it depends,
It's
which
very
I know is,
nuanced.
I don't want to sound, it sounds like a cop out, but so I'll try to explain why it depends. But the easiest way to tell if you're shifting towards doing too much when you're overtraining or injury is, are you recovering well from day to day and week to week? And if you are, then your body's handling the volume and intensity mixture that you've built into your program. And a simple way to test this, obviously, it's just your feeling about your body. The other is what you notice in terms of improved performance. Now, not every workout or every week is going to set new personal bests. The world doesn't work that way. But over the course of a few weeks, you should have a few high spots, a few workouts where you go, I definitely feel fitter than I did, a week or 2 or 3 weeks ago. And if you don't have that sensation of improving performance, then something's going on, because you're probably, and most likely, if you're training, especially as much as you're training at 9 to 13 hours a week, then your problem is probably rest. There's probably not enough recovery built into your training plan. But the simplest way is to, like, are you feeling excited and rested and ready to go each workout? And are you seeing improved performance on a, let's say, bi-weekly or so basis? That would be the simplest way to try to help you with that.
Yeah, I think as an athlete myself, I notice because I can grind, and I think a lot of our listeners can too, if they're ultra runners or have been doing endurance training for a long time, they could just grind week in, week out, week in, week out. But if you tried to do something slightly harder, if you feel just exhausted and like crap, probably don't add more volume too, right? Like, I think a lot of you can do a high amount of low intensity, just grinding, for lack of a better term, but you need a little bit of rest. And like Scott said, if you try something that is a bit testing, do you see any improvement? Because I think a lot of listeners fall into this category, Scott, of just doing tons of stuff day in, day out, day in, day out. So,
yeah. And another good way I just thought of to answer that question too is, and this is something I've used for years, and we, stress with the athletes that we coach, is a high RPE, or, relative perceived exertion. So if you feel like you're working hard and your heart rate is low, there's almost only one reason that happens, and it's because you're tired. So even if you're just going out for an easy run, just a normal low intensity day for you, and you're noticing, man, I can't get my heart rate up because I feel like I'm working hard, but my heart's not working very hard, then you're tired and you need a break, you need a rest. On the opposite side, usually a high heart rate and feeling really good, like a very low RPE. Now, this isn't always the case, and certainly not the case with people who have aerobic deficiency syndrome, because they generally will be training very, very easily because they're aerobically deficient. But for someone who's relatively fit, if let's say they're in the middle of a taper period, or they're coming off of a week of no training because they were sick, and then they start back to training, we'll often see quite a high heart rate, but they'll feel really fresh, and the RPE will be quite low. And I've seen that for years, especially in a taper for people who are headed into a big event, is that their heart rate just jacks up really quickly. But the main thing, I think, as a warning sign for people is to pay attention to, if you've got a high RPE and a low heart rate, there's 99% of the time that happens is because you're tired.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that in a manner of speaking, it's not obviously this simple, but the heart is in a way a slave to the muscles. It's trying to supply the oxygen that the muscles need. Well, if the muscles are tired and you can't run very, they're squawking at you, and you feel like you're working hard, but you're not going very fast. Well, your heart is going to not going to need to pump as much blood because you're not running as fast, you're not working as hard, even though it might feel like you are. So the way your heart responds is to lower the heart rate. So that's why this works with this idea of low heart rate, high RPE indicating fatigue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Scott, a term that gets thrown around in this vein is carrying like residual fatigue. And I always have an image of like some sort of battery running on E or something. But when people are quote unquote carrying residual fatigue, or is it what's actually happening in our bodies is depleted glycogen, damaged muscles? What's building up?
There's a lot of mechanisms for fatigue, and I wrote quite a bit about it in training for the uphill athlete, because it is I didn't write a treatise on it or anything like that. It's kind of a complicated subject, but when you have that heavy dead leg feeling, I'm pretty convinced from my reading that that's probably most likely due to low glycogen, that you've just depleted the glycogen stores in those muscles and they need some days to recharge. Then, but there also is a nervous system fatigue. There's a central, the motor nerves actually become fatigued. The nerve impulse travels down the nerve by way of chemical signals at the synapses. And so these chemicals, and I think it's calcium and potassium are two of the main ones, they get pumped across the membrane at the synapse, but then they have to be repumped back onto the other side so that they can discharge again. So they're kind of like a battery. They have to they have to build up a potential on one side in order to have the nervous signal transmit across the synapse to the rest of the nerve. And when those little pumps stop pumping, then the horsepower of the muscle is going to go down. The signal that goes down to the muscles in your legs is going to be reduced. And especially if you're trying to run very fast, those fast twitch muscle fibers, or the higher power muscle fibers, they have what's called a higher action potential. They need more voltage to make them fire. And so if those little junctures in the synapses are not able to transmit a high amount of power across them, then those fast twitch fibers, they won't even fire. They won't reach their action potential, and they can't even fire. So that's what you were just saying, Kylee. You may be able to go out and slog around, or go for a hike when your legs are tired because you're not moving that fast. But if you were to suddenly go and try to, run, a 6-minute mile, you might not even be able to do it because the muscles might just say, well, we don't have any power here. So there's a number of ways that fatigue manifests itself in our body. And some of them are very short term, like let's say you're trying to do pull-ups and you do pull-ups to failure. which for, many of us might be, 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever. But when you fail, the reason you're failing is there's these potassium pumps inside the muscles themselves that move the potassium across the membrane in the muscle. That is one of the things that helps it contract. And when those pumps, when they've done all their pumping and all the potassium is moved to one side of the muscle membrane, then it can't contract anymore and you can't do another pull-up. So that's a very short-term type of fatigue. But that would be, an example. That's not a type of fatigue that most of us are going to encounter when we're out for a 4-hour run in the mountains, though. The kind of fatigues we're going to encounter will be more, glycogen depletion and this central nervous system fatigue that I was talking about.
Would you say the central nervous system and the central governor, are those similar, used a bit interchangeably, or different?
They're different. So the central governor, we should do a talk on the central
Yeah,
governor.
I'm taking you way into the weeds here, Scott.
Yeah,
It just,
no,
it
it's a
made,
great, it's one of my favorite topics because I think it
Okay.
explains fatigue better than all the other fatigue models out there. And yeah, maybe we'll record a
Yeah.
central governor talk. I know it's in dispute, the theory of the central governor, but when I explain it to people, I think they'll understand, like, oh, that's actually a pretty good model. We don't understand fatigue completely, is what this comes down to. There's something, but every type of fatigue, whether it's that fatigue that I just mentioned in the pull-ups, or the fatigue of running out of glycogen, 3 hours into a run, or the fatigue that comes from, let's say, like it's 8K into a 10K race. I mean, every type of fatigue you can mention, every mechanism for fatigue has the exact same response, and that is that the brain stops sending or can't send, or we don't know why, but the signals through the motor nerves decrease, and so power output drops off. So every single mechanism for fatigue has that same response. So somehow or another, the brain is involved.
Yeah.
And Tim Noakes came up with this idea. Well, actually, I think he just refined an old idea that's called the central governor. It was discovered or proposed, let's say, in the early 20th century. But we'll do a deep dive on that another time.
Yeah, I think it is that we've talked a little bit outside of the podcast, I think last week, about this, and I think the listeners would be interested in it. So to be continued. There we go.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. We'll move on to our next question. And this says, greetings from Brazil. Since the addition of running power for most of the newer devices, the standard TSS, or training stress score, and decoupling metric in training peaks is now power. I've noticed that the PTSS, or power training stress score, tends to be higher than the heart rate TSS, and in my view has a better representation of efforts. I'm using the 5 zones suggested by TP training peaks based on my running power threshold value. The point is, should I update my power zones in the same proportion as my heart rate zones? Since working with power, the decoupling metric is now PWHR instead of PAHR. The best take on setting the power zones correctly should be redoing the anaerobic test and aerobic tests with power. So there's a lot of terminology in there. I think he's mostly asking about heart rate TSS versus power training stress score. So
yes, and I would agree with this the question he's asking here, or the statement he makes, is that running power in theory should be a better way to calculate training stress than heart rate, because heart rate is a proxy for the work you're doing, whereas power is truly the work you're doing. Now, the problem is, how accurate is the power meter, and is it actually capturing all the power you're doing, or is it wildly optimistic or pessimistic. And we don't really care what the actual numbers are here, but what we do care is that is it repeatable, so that every run you go out and do, is it able to compare that? Does that power compare accurately with the run you did the day before or something like that? But in general, just like on a bicycle, measuring, once power meters came on bicycles, people stopped using heart rate on bicycles for training. They might collect heart rate as an interesting artifact of the workout or the race, but it's not really how they monitor or gauge intensity. They use power. So I want to put that out there. I think power is a great idea. The question is, are you actually getting good power numbers, and are they repeatable from workout to workout, so that that you're comparing apples to apples from one workout to the next? But then this second part of this question is, like he says, the decoupling metric is power to heart rate versus pace to heart rate. The thing you need to do is you need to redo your aerobic threshold test, where the heart rate drift would be the one I would recommend, and the anaerobic threshold test using power rather than heart rate. So you would see, let's say you ran at a steady heart rate and watch what happens to your power over the course of an hour. Or maybe you run a steady power and notice that your heart rate goes up over the course of an hour. So that would be the way that you do the heart rate, or what we would call the heart rate drift test. But now it would still be a heart rate drift test, I guess. Then the anaerobic threshold test would be like what cyclists do, what they call a functional threshold test, where they basically do a 1 hour time trial and see what their average power is for that. And, I wouldn't you don't need to, if you're running, I would say an hour, unless you're an elite level, an hour could be too long to get a good number. I would, suggest somewhere in the half an hour to 45-minute range would be a good length for a anaerobic threshold power test. But you're onto something here. So yeah, and I think you've got the right idea. You just need to redo those tests using power.
Yeah, and Scott, I haven't been well versed in this topic super recently, but I recall in the past the running power meters, why we didn't use them as a metric as much was because of the undulation we train mountain athletes mostly. Would the power for running still be just mostly applicable for flatter track running, or has it it advanced?
They've improved. Yeah, they've actually improved quite a bit. So the new version of the Stride, the algorithm that's built into that seems to work. One of the athletes I coach, professional ultra runner, uses a Stride power meter, and it looks, again, I don't know if the actual power numbers and the wattage is correct. We have no way of checking that, but it does seem to respond quite well, and it correlates well with his heart rate and his perception of exertion. So I think it's probably pretty good. And then there was the Run with Power model that I did a podcast with the developer of that that app. It's available for free. I did 2 podcasts with him, Marcus. And so people might want to go back and listen to those. And that is, you don't have to buy a power meter. The Stride is a rather expensive device that you put on your shoe. Instead, if you have one of the higher level, let's say Garmin chest straps, they actually produce power. They produce a power output from the chest strap, and it uses an accelerometer inside the little heart rate monitor. And what Marcus's algorithm in his app does is it takes that accelerometer data, combining it with your pace, and I think it can monitor grade. I could be wrong about that, but it combines all of those things and it produces a power number. And so when I played around with his power meter, what I mean is power meter, I just mean his app. Again, it's not a piece of hardware you have to buy. It's a free piece of software you can download. But when I messed with it, I noticed that running at the same pace on a nice smooth trail and then suddenly encountering, like, how a lot of trails will cross a scree field and, or even a section where there's nothing but, rubble and cobbles the size of your fist. And it's a little challenging to balance on. But I would notice if I tried to maintain that same speed through that scree area, then my power would go way up. And it makes total sense to me. You're working harder because there's probably more vertical oscillation in your body, and so I think some of these new power meters, and the one that Marcus did is really quite remarkable. I was really impressed about the work he had done in producing that. So I would encourage people to go look at those podcasts that we did them a couple of years ago. You'd have to scroll back through our podcast feed. And maybe what I'll do is after we're done recording this, Kylee, we'll put a show note in here with links to those
the
power meter podcasts.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's great. And yeah, just a reminder, these are all just metrics of monitoring our training. And you said that your friend found that the power and the heart rate often aligned. And I've trained many mountain bikers now as well. And we've used heart rate. They're not professionals. And it can work as well. So I'd say get into it, but don't get lost in the weeds on trying to collect data too. Just make sure you're in the right zones.
Heart rate is still a pretty decent way to monitor the intensity of your training. It's not perfect, but again, I don't think power is perfect either. But don't feel like if you're not using a power meter, you're missing out on your training.
Yeah. All right. Our next question is regarding intensity of muscular endurance workouts. And this listener is asking, what level of delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS, afterwards is acceptable? What should the soreness level be like in the following 1 to 5 days? And guide the athlete in either decreasing or increasing the intensity of their next ME session. I think we've had this question before, but it's commonly asked, so we'll quickly answer it again, maybe.
Yeah, I would like to say that, if you are still sore 6 days, 5 or 6 days after, then you just went way too hard. You jumped too high, you pushed too hard, or you used too much resistance, too much, maybe a heavy weight vest or whatever, because then you've just done a whole bunch of muscle damage that's taken quite a while to heal, and it's probably had a pretty damaging effect on the amount of other training you could do during the rest of the week. So I would say back off on the intensity such that you can, be pretty recovered a couple days later. I don't think you should be feeling you may be a little bit stiff, but you warm up through that stiffness 2 days out. But if it's much worse than that, I'd say back, reduce the intensity of what you did, or maybe reduce the volume of the muscular endurance work.
Yeah, I actually just had a conversation with an athlete today about this, that one of the goals of training is consistency and getting the volume in throughout the week that you need to. So if one workout takes you out for the entire week, it's not good training, right? It's recovery, doing just enough stimulus, but you can still work on other things to slowly over time make gains. So I think that's something to think about. Yeah. The next question here, this person says, the next question for your monthly Q&A session, which I love, by the way. Like most runners and backcountry skiers, I probably don't do enough strength training because it's my weakness, but I've been much better about doing muscular endurance and hill sprints. But what about heavier lifts via squats and deadlifts? I don't hear this get discussed as often in the podcasts. What's the best way to incorporate conventional strength, or is it even needed?
Well, I like the play on words here, that strength is your weakness. That's in that first sentence, probably because my strength is my weakness. Yes, lifting weights in a gym is probably the fastest way to get strong. Now, the question with strength training always is, how much of that weightlifting strength that you do in the gym will transfer over into your running, or in your case, the backcountry skiing. How much, because let's say a squat, which is a great exercise, or a deadlift, those are really good full body exercises. But at what point is the time you spend becoming stronger at squats going to stop benefiting your performance as an athlete? And this is a big problem with, so it used to be that strength training was kind of the area of interest to athletes, and it was only interesting to athletes in such that the strength they built improved their performance, because that's what the athletes really interested in, is the performance in their sport. But with the popularity of, even though people don't realize it, I mean, bodybuilding, strength building techniques of bodybuilding and powerlifting began to dominate the way people thought about strength training, especially in the US. But probably 30 years ago, we started to see where people going into the gym and using bodybuilding strength training techniques, which are designed to make your muscles bigger and maybe stronger, but that's not their point. And powerlifting, which is again mainly hypertrophy type training. So this is a kind of a nuanced and complicated sort of subject. But what I like to say to people is, if you're going to be in the gym, then unless your goal is to just lift a heavy, do a heavy squats, which for some people that is their goal. They just want to be stronger in the gym. But if it isn't, then you need to be doing some exercises that will transfer over very well to like running, and skiing. And those are single leg exercises. So what my go-to is, and Kylee knows this because I've got her doing this, is the Bulgarian split squat. I think it's one of the best single leg exercises out there for athletes, because it's essentially getting all the weight on one leg, but it's, doing a one-legged squat is pretty challenging for most of us. And so by having a foot on an elevated bench behind you gives you just enough balance that you can do, essentially a one-legged squat. That's what this Bulgarian split squat is. So there's tons of information on this on YouTube. You can see how they're done. And if you had, if you feel like your legs could be stronger, that would be my go-to for you, is to and you don't want to spend hours and hours in the week in the gym. Again, there's nothing wrong with a squat and a deadlift, but the problem with both of those is you have both feet firmly planted on the ground when you lift this heavy weight, which is why people can lift such heavy weights, is they've got both feet on the ground. And so the little stabilizer muscles in your hips don't need to do much stabilizing. They can actually contribute to the movement, that they become what's called prime movers and not so much stabilizers. And when you're outside, running or skiing, you need those stabilizer muscles to hold you in your hip in the correct position while you're balanced on one foot. And the Bulgarian split squat puts a lot of emphasis on those hip stabilizer muscles. I mean, you will not you won't be able to Bulgarian split squat half of what you can do in a normal two-legged squat. Nobody can do that. It requires quite a bit more strength. So let's say you could, do a 200-pound normal squat. My guess is for most people, doing 60 to 80 pounds on a Bulgarian split squat would probably be max. So it will reduce your max lift.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, just from being coached by you, but also for us coaching other clients. Often when we start with them, in addition to an aerobic and anaerobic threshold, we do a basic strength assessment. So basic strength training, I think, really does have a place if you have never lifted before and you need a little bit of base strength to just begin. Like if you can't do a single leg squat, you shouldn't probably jump into muscular endurance. So if you're very, very green, doing a basic strength program for a few months is certainly valid, I think, as well. Hey, Scott?
Yeah, and I think, that's these squats and deadlifts, because people can lift pretty heavy with them, they
Mm-hmm.
have an injury risk associated with them. And if you're going to do heavy squats and deadlifts, you need to be sure you're using good technique, because it's pretty easy
Mm-hmm.
to hurt yourself with this.
Yeah.
And I've often used this is again a rule of thumb, so it's not specific to any one person. But if you can't squat or let's say you can't deadlift your body weight, then you probably could benefit from doing some very general strength like
Mm-hmm.
deadlifting or squatting. Um,
Yeah.
but let's say you can squat twice your body weight. Is it going to make you a better runner to be able to squat 2.5 times your body weight? I can almost guarantee you it won't.
Mm-hmm. It might make you a
So
worse runner.
it might, yeah.
Who knows?
So we just have to, that's where we don't know how much general strength and specific strength, or how much general strength transfers over to the sport. But we do know that as the weight goes up, the transference over to the sport isn't very good. Otherwise, power lifters would be the best runners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. When I was speed skating, I was a sprinter, and in the late 90s and early 2000s, our strength training was like 1 to 2 rep max, as heavy as you can possibly lift. And I was recently talking to a current national team sprinter, and their thought process on how to build that, even that power, has evolved over time. Um, there is times to lift really, really heavy weights, but it was a very, I feel, common way of training a number of years ago, is just lift really, really heavy. So
Yeah.
it's evolved a little bit. Mm-hmm. Our next question is from someone from Kansas City. And he says, I'm a climber living in Kansas City. I have access to moderately steep hills, which I do my zone 2 runs on, but they aren't quite steep enough for a proper ME workout. I know you have spoke on this many times, but what specifically is your preferred go-to gym ME workout? I don't have access to Stairmaster, but most other gym equipment, including plyo boxes. I'm trying to get my legs as strong as possible for a trip to climb on the Diamond in Rocky Mountain National Park in September. I'm currently doing zone 2 running 3 hours a week, basic strength workouts, Bulgarian split squats. Thank you, and I love all your work. I think we have a resource for muscular endurance on our website, don't we, Scott?
We do, although, if you don't have access to a Stairmaster and you don't have a hill, then you're going to be stepping up and down off of a box in the gym with the barbell on your back. I mean, that's what it comes down to, if you really want to work on this. And it's a great, it's boring. It's even worse than a Stairmaster, but it will work. And I've trained people like this, where we just did that, you're going to do an hour of stepping up and down off this box, with, whatever weight you need on your back. So I would say that would be what my recommendation is, given your constraints of what you're working with. And I think that will, one of the factors, though, you will be facing coming from Kansas City to the Diamond is altitude. And, not that you have a good way to ameliorate that, because, you're going from sea level to, the bottom of the Diamond is almost about 13,000 feet. All you can do is, be as rested as you can when you show up there, and be aware that the loss in performance that you're going to feel will almost undoubtedly have nothing to do with your fitness, but will be almost completely dependent on your acclimatization. So, don't be surprised if, you feel like half the person you were back at home. Again, it's not a reflection of your training. It's just a reflection of the fact that there's, at 13,000 feet, there's about 50% of the oxygen there is in Kansas City in each breath you take.
Yeah. Yeah. And you kind of asked about the specifics of muscular endurance workouts. Scott put in his book, basically gave you the information there. So Training for the Uphill Athlete has step-by-step on a muscular endurance workout for free if you get it from the library. So information's out there.
It's even on our website in the muscular endurance. There's an article called Everything You Need to Know About Muscular Endurance. So
there you go. So yeah, look that up. Another question I think we've addressed, we can kind of tap on this one quickly. Someone asked, best way to get better at hiking faster for ultra running. So
Yes,
just
practice hiking. I mean, there's a technique to walking fast.
Mhm.
And, I've known people who can, easily walk 12-minute miles. And it's not blazingly fast as a running pace, but it's pretty brisk if you try to walk that fast. So what I would do is spend more time walking and practicing your walking so that
Mhm.
you can feel the fact that there's you know there's different speeds of walking. And I think one time we had this question and I mentioned the fact that, so my wife is 5'2" and I'm 6 feet tall. And often when I walk with her, I have to hurry to keep up with her. She's got her legs are, 3/4 the length of mine, but she
Mhm.
has such a fast tempo, then she can walk really fast. So it can be trained. And so I
Mhm.
would suggest, just starting to play with that.
Good. Our next question is there a requisite fitness level you should hit before getting sport specific? For example, 22 pace, max pull-ups, etc. At what point in the training program do you decide you haven't matured enough for your event, test, race, and need to revisit some training aspects before another attempt?
That's a good question. So basically, how much, non-specific kind of base training do you need before you shift? I mean, what I would say is look at the demands of the event you're training for. And at some point, regardless of your, let's say max pull up strength, you're going to go climb the nose. Well, at some point, you need to just get out and climb more and not worry about your pull ups anymore. Or if let's say it was a running race you were headed toward, and you still were aerobically deficient, 8 weeks out from the race, I would say, well, whatever we've been able to get aerobically with your training up to this point, that's great and we'll continue. But we do have to now add some more intensity into your training program these last couple of months, or you're going to not have a good race. Just like this point I was making about the pull-ups and climbing. So
Mhm.
what I normally tell people is, regardless of your base fitness level, when you get within a couple months of your goal, you better start adding specific training in. Um, Otherwise, your performance will not be what you'd hoped. And it's, if you're, like I said, if you're still aerobically deficient or you can still only do 3 pull-ups, well, that's the breaks. You're going to have to build that in the next training cycle.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think also reframing, like if you're doing a race or something and you're newer to it, it isn't a failure if for some reason you don't finish or you don't do well. Uh, all races can just be information gathering as well. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's just thinking that.
The mountains
Um,
will still be there.
exactly. If you get 3/4 of the way up and back off, that's information for next time. Our next question is from someone who says, I've been training for 18 months and I'm about to head up Mount Rainier. I have a few more objectives for this year, plus some big plans for next year. I'm also starting to feel, I think, a bit of fatigue after 18 months of training and a lightly pulled hip flexor, as well as some other injuries. My question is, at what point do you really pull back for a minute to let your body chill, even if this means losing some fitness? And if you're taking a break from training, how long is too long? I'm not experiencing overtraining symptoms, but I'm worried I'm just straight up taxing my muscles. I'm not sure where to push through versus just to take a break.
Take a break. That's what you need to do. If you feel that, the fatigue, you're not recovering well, and especially if you're starting to flirt with some injury, then you need to lighten the training load. It doesn't mean you need to sit on the couch for 2 weeks, but it might mean that, okay, I need to change things up a little bit. Okay, maybe I've been doing a lot of running. Well, how about just getting on the bike for a few days? Let your running legs recover. And this hip flexor issue that you're talking about, can be a really long-term nagging injury that I've worked with athletes that have had it and keep it for a year or more before it goes away. So, don't let that thing flare up. If you're doing something like running or hiking uphill or whatever it is, and it's aggravating that hip flexor, you need to stop that activity and let that calm down. Otherwise, you might be living with it for a long time. So, remember, you get stronger not when you train, but after when you recover. That's when fitness is really built, is during the recovery period. So make sure you're getting enough rest, you're eating well, you're sleeping well. And then, just because you back off a little bit on your training, you chances are your performance is going to improve rather than decline. Your fitness, because you're carrying this level of fatigue, it's masking your fitness. It's meaning that you can't perform well. And so I would say that the best thing for you to do right now is to dial back just a little bit, for a week or 2 weeks, something like that, and see if that doesn't help, start making you feel better. But the a higher level of chronic fatigue, which it sounds like you might be starting to deal with a little bit, is something to pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think it's funny. He said he's not experiencing like really adverse symptoms, but unless you had an acute traumatic injury, like you fell off something or you got a boulder hit in your leg, if you're getting overuse injuries, your body's telling you something. So,
Yeah.
so essentially you are having information given to you. And I think even if you're starting to enter that thought process, if you're usually highly motivated, that's something to think about. If you're thinking, I might really need a break. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
good idea
Yeah.
yeah. You probably can't go wrong. If you've been training for 18 months, your fitness is there. You can't go wrong with just reducing the training load a little bit.
Yeah, I know, Scott, you made me think differently about this because last year I did a huge stage race, BC bike race, 5 days in a row of training. And then you said, don't do anything for the next week. And I was just like, what? Because I've always just taken like 2 to 3 days off. And the concept of, a week of unstructured felt a bit foreign. But I think what it said to me is oftentimes we undervalue that rest. And even just
Mhm.
mentally, I felt motivated
Yeah.
after a week, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Next question we have here is, this person is saying, due to an injury, I'm not able to do weighted carries up the local hill. So I have this indoor option. I start with a warm up on the elliptical, then do 5-minute blocks with a loaded pack, alternating step ups, and then elliptical in between for 6 rounds. Is this a valid option for muscular endurance workout? Am I missing something if I switch the legs each time on top of the box? Um,
Yeah. Okay. So this is almost identical to the question we just had about,
mhm.
person who didn't have access to a stair machine. I mean, this is certainly would work, although I think if you've got a goal of, let's say, climbing a big mountain, I would suggest doing, unless there's an injury issue, I would just do the step ups. I don't know what the easy elliptical is doing for you. I mean, it's just allowing a recovery period. So you're doing kind of like weighted step up intervals, which again, it can work. But I think our normal approach with this, like we just talked about with that other person, would be to step up and down off that box continuously. And if you can't do it for more than, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes at a time, then sure, take a break. But you might also want to think about lowering the weight that you're carrying. Then that would be another alternative. But eventually, you would like to be able to get this to where it's continuous work, not done in an interval fashion.
Yeah, I'm curious with this question too. Maybe they can DM us what kind of injury they would have that they can't walk uphill outside, but they could still do step ups in the gym. It would
Yeah.
seemingly utilize pretty much the same thing. So
And I
it's
would
kind of
say
interesting.
just switch legs at the top on the top of the box each step. That's, that's kind of a more normal walking movement rather than,
Mhm.
let's say, doing 10 on the right, 10 on the left. I mean, it doesn't really matter that much, but you don't have to keep count that way if you just
Mhm.
alternate legs.
Yeah. Good. And I think we're at our last question here, Scott. So this person is asking, I've been researching the concept of CO2 tolerance. I recently did a CO2 tolerance test myself, and the results were well below what's considered both normal and healthy. This comes as a surprise to me as I have a large aerobic capacity from my career as a mountain athlete. I have suffered from obstructive sleep apnea for years before this. I think they just added that as a little bit of background.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how it relates to sleep apnea, but I mean, for people that aren't familiar with CO2 tolerance, all you have to do is hold your breath and you'll understand how this works is so what there's a part of our brain that triggers us to take our next breath. Now it's subconscious, of course, but it's not triggered by a decrease in oxygen content in the blood. It's triggered by an increase in this carbon dioxide in the blood. And so what happens is when, let's say you hold your breath, then as the carbon dioxide levels um, in your blood begin to go up or get to a certain point, you'll have this sensation of suffocating and you'll need to take a breath. So, and that you can train this so that you can, essentially it's like breath holding is to a large extent is what this is talking about. And you can train it so that you can hold your breath for longer, essentially. This is something swimmers get really good at because they can't take a breath anytime they want. And when you take a breath and have to turn your head to the side, it affects your stroke and slows you down a little bit. So swimmers will try to minimize their breathing time, and they have to reach a kind of a balance. You need to get enough oxygen in, but not breathe too often. So yeah, and then there's a lot of, and I'm not going to say woo woo, but there's a lot of sort of, I don't know how sophisticated or how scientific the research is, but there seems to be some health benefits from having a higher CO2 tolerance. Everything from relaxation, lower stress, who knows what else. I'm not by any means any kind of an expert on it. My experience with it has just been like with what do they call those free divers, people who go to try to dive as far as low as they can, deep diving into the ocean, and then come back up. And they work a lot on breath holding, and they have a very high CO2 tolerance. Some of them, in the case, it's so high they die because they manage to overcome this suffocation response. And of course, if you're down in the water and you haven't reached the surface yet, you still can't take a breath. So you're forced to come to the surface. But a number of those people have actually died from asphyxiation, essentially. So you can train this stuff. Now, what it has to do with, your performance as an athlete or, your normal health, that's way beyond, I think, our ability to tell you, and how that might affect your sleep apnea. I have no idea. But I don't think you could draw the conclusion that just because you have a big aerobic capacity that you should have a high CO2 tolerance. Um, so again, that's about the extent of my knowledge of CO2 tolerance. I'm sorry, I can't give you
Mm-hmm.
anything more definitive than that.
Yeah, this is a newer concept to me, to be honest. Just reading the question earlier today. How do they test that in a lab? Do you even know? Like
Um, I would
basically
imagine
hold your
that
breath.
I don't know. I'm going to
Yeah.
imagine it has something to do with, with holding your breath. And there
Mm-hmm.
are the ways they train this. There's a number of breathing techniques that are used. That some of them are come from yoga. Um, they're basically one. I think one of them is called square breathing, where you have
Mm-hmm.
you inhale to the count of 4 slowly, then you hold your breath for the count of 4, then you exhale slowly to the count of 4. Then you hold your breath again for the count of 4 before repeating that whole cycle. And that is supposed to help improve CO2 tolerance. It's also, as you can imagine, kind of a calming thing to
Calming.
do. So I can see definite benefits to this, but I don't know what its relation, unless you're a swimmer or a
Yeah.
deep sea or what are those, free diver. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how it would relate to your performance as an athlete.
Yeah, it wouldn't
Especially,
have anything to do with altitude. I was thinking maybe this person's some mountaineer, but high altitude. I don't.
no,
Mm-mm.
yeah, Bill, having one of the problems with altitude, one of the responses to altitude is to have an increased level of CO2. Your body becomes more acidic. But I don't know that. Yeah, I don't see how that would be a benefit, but and not
Well,
we're not
yeah.
experts on it. So
But
good luck with that.
yeah,
It's a
this is
great
why
question.
we like this podcast because you guys lob interesting softballs at us each month.
Yeah.
Things that
Yeah.
we're not on our radar, which is fascinating. Hey, Scott?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. We learn.
Hmm.
We're learning too as we go.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
thanks everyone. We really appreciate all the questions. This has been a long one. Yeah, keep those questions coming, and we'll do another one in August. So
Yeah.
we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks.